Welcome, everyone. We will get started shortly, but I'd like to give you just a few moments to get your audio preferences set before we begin. One thing I would like to let you know is you can start your closed captions, and we have a wonderful ASL interpreter, Nora, today. So if you go to the bottom section and select interpretation, you can go ahead and activate your ASL interpretation. All right, well, hello and welcome. Before I hand it off to our presenters, I just want to cover a few technical details, just in case you haven't joined ACRO webinar in the past. It is like a Zoom webinar, except that your microphones and cameras are turned off to interact with each other and with the presenters. You have two main options. One is the chat button. You can default it to the host and panelists to chat with the host and panelists, or select everyone if you want to communicate with everybody. And then the other one, where we actually encourage you to post your questions to ensure that all of your questions are being answered, is the Q&A button. Wendy and I will be monitoring this. So you can ask at any time, you can ask anonymously, and without any further ado, I would like to hand us off to Dr. Wendy Kilgore.
Thank you, Wilma, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for Collaboration, Competition, or Convergence, the relationship between professional and continuing education and traditional academic programs. As Belma just covered, there's a housekeeping here. If you wouldn't mind putting the Q&A, your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll begin around the 50-minute mark after our panelists discuss. And we also will record this and post it to the ACRO website. Moderators today are myself, Senior Director of Research at ACRO in Seattle with Modern Campus. In Seattle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes, thanks, Wendy. Hi, everyone. I'm Seattle Ravello, and I'm a Solutions Marketing Manager at Modern Campus. I'm super excited to be here today.
Thank you, Seattle. We're going to hold off on having our panelists introduce themselves until we actually hand the mic over to them. But some of them are on camera here at the moment. Actually, Jim and Bruce are. I can't see all the pictures, but they're here. And Melanie also is joining us so representatives from UPSIA and ACRO, and we will be bouncing some questions to them, and they'll be talking amongst themselves about some of the data we're going to share today and what it means to them, their members, our organizations, and higher education overall. Seattle?
Awesome. Thanks, Wendy. So for those of you that might not be familiar with who we are at Modern Campus, our purpose is to engage modern learners for life. And we offer solutions to foster that at every stage of the student life cycle. Anyone in the registrar or academic affairs office might know our Acalog or Curriculog softwares. Those are our products for catalog and curriculum management. But we also offer solutions for web content management, conversational text messaging, class schedule management, student engagement, student scheduling, and continuing education. So we're super excited to be here to be able to sponsor the research that we're going to be talking about today. And thank you so much to ACRO for having us on the call.
You're welcome, Seattle. And again, thank you to Modern Campus for making this research possible and actually connecting Bruce and Jim and I. It was insights from them that says, let's try to tackle this topic together. And so that was a great insight, and we're really happy to present the results here. So I want to also thank UPSIA, where Bruce and Jim are the representatives here today, for partnering us on this project. We couldn't have done the work in the way we did it and examined the data without their participation. So thank you to UPSIA as well. Some of you on the webinar today may have actually responded to this survey because it went out to our primary contacts. But I wanted to give you this research framing questions. And while you're taking a look at those, I'll talk a bit about our response sets. We targeted U.S. institutions serving undergraduate students. So they could have been comprehensive institutions or undergraduate only institutions or community colleges and technical colleges. We had 319 individual responses. They represented 309 institutions. And the reason we did that is because by targeting both UPSIA members and ACRO members, we were really hoping to get some pairs of people responding, one representing the professional and continuing ed side, and the other the traditional academic registrar related. And then we could be able to compare that information. So we were lucky to end up with 10 dyads, and we look at that data separately from everything else in this research. Otherwise, we're looking at it collectively because we had one response per institution. The report, you all receive it because you're participating in this webinar. It will be released on July 24th. It's a doozy. It's like 20 or 30 pages long. It's pretty long, at least for Bruce. There was a lot of data in this data set. We wanted to ask everything, and we pretty much did. So it's a big one out there. So we're going to highlight the data today and then give our panelists some time. So this is definitely not a comprehensive dive into the data set. Put these definitions up here because it's what kind of made us think about how are these two divisions working with each other or not working each other or competing with each other. And so we wanted to see what degree they were collaborating, competing for the same resources, or converging. Are they kind of melding into becoming one, or is it some combination thereof? And to begin with, do they even have separate units for professional continuing education and the academic registrar? By units, we mean those that are defined as budgetarily administrative separate units, or is this work decentralized across many places at the institution? So we had to put this framing out there of collaboration, competition, or convergence to find out what we were looking at. Just a few key insights here, because again, don't want to spend a ton of time. I want to give the panelists some time. 57% of respondents report that their institution has an administratively and budgetarily separate unit. That is compared to the rest who don't have that. They offer professional and continuing education. Some of them do, some of them don't, but scattered, separated out and decentralized through multiple sources of administrative oversight, multiple different budget sources and different departments. So they do that. It's really decentralized. Among those with the PCE unit, 93% report that the unit is separate from the academic registrar, and the other 7%, it's actually a combined unit. Have you seen our benchmarking before? You know that there's all different ways and configurations that institutions do everything. So there's no one size fits all. 62% of these who have PCE units report that other departments and divisions also offer PCE classes or programs. So let's think about that for a second. That means 2/3 of institutions who have a structure that says professional continuing education is, by their own definition, budgetarily and administratively separate. Nearly 2/3 of them also have these classes, professional continuing classes and programs being offered in various other locations. They describe it as being offered by different academic departments, different kind of outreach programs all over the place. And we will show you a little bit of that in a bit with the data. So from the get-go, we already, in this benchmarking of these 309 institutions, there's not a lot of convergence so far. So it's the data right off the bat. It's like, whoa, there's a little bit of everything here. It's a smorgasbord. It's a buffet of practices and configurations so far. In this sample of institution, we did find sort of holistically that collaboration, competition, or convergence exists at some level between these two administrative units where they exist. This Venn diagram is quite simple, as most Venn diagrams are, but it's really descriptive of this data. So we had some respondents that really were in competition with each other for resources. We had others that were tightly converging and others that just worked very closely together and collaborated. And then we had that shaded areas in between where there's a little bit of that, a little bit of the other. So it was all over the place, which is why we wanted to start getting a handle on this and understand how this works and frame it around student success. The level to which they collaborate or compete or converge varies not only with across institutions that responded, but within. So they described in their own opinion data that even departments can compete with each other that offer like the different courses. They don't necessarily know who's offering what or the oversight of it. And others are like, yeah, we work really well together. We know everybody's doing, even though we have a professional continuing ed unit and these others working on it. We have a good idea what they're doing, and we work really well with the academic registrar. One of the things we wanted to benchmark, there's a lot of data on this slide, is the type of credit offered through the registrars, the PCE unit, and or other institutional entities. The yellow represents the not offered at all at the institution. The red is the academic registrar, the gray is the PCE unit, and the blue is those others, the other people that can offer these. So what you start to see from this data set already is that there's a lot of course offerings, credits types being given to students. So these are undergraduate students. They may or may not have a lot of experience in higher education, and they are presented sometimes with all of these different types of choices. Sometimes while they're in a program for one type of credit, they're going to be exposed to the possibility of taking a different type of credit along with it. But it starts to describe that we have a lot of things going on at institutions, and students have to understand this, and the institution itself does as well. This one is the type of credit that's offered by both. I took that other slide that you saw with it and said, where is the overlap? So where's the between what the PCE unit academic registrars in this sample? So these are not really large numbers, but you can see that there is definitely some overlap in the type of credits that's offered by them. So we have some professional and continuing education units, 11% of them in this sample, that are also offering academic credit. And we also, those other areas are much smaller numbers there, but it's pretty much across the board. We didn't have a zero. We didn't have any place where they very clearly identified as separate units and not having any overlap. We looked at the type of credits, and then we also looked at the type of credentials. So this slide represents the type of credentials that are offered by both those two units as well, the overlap. The report itself has more detail in it when you have access to it. It just doesn't just talk about this overlap, it talks about the full offerings by percentages. So even here, we have quite a bit of overlap. A quarter of the respondents, for example, both offer certificates of some kind. And they are also moving into the space of micro-credentials and badges and comprehensive learner records and certificates of completion. Probably already given away the end of the story here, right? About what this looks like. Lots of overlap. We also asked the population about what we described as special population programs. And again, we have this data here, it's stacked. I didn't put the little data percentages on here. This is more meant to be visual, where blue is the academic registrar, red is indicating that they do not offer those special programs at that institution, gray is offered by both, and yellow is the PCE unit. So there are, again, the yellow represents that particular special population program is offered by both the professional continuing education programs and by the academic registrar. The ones that tend to be the responsibility of the PC units are the alternative non-degree credentials, the certificates, the corporate training, the OSHR senior programming, and the tech industry credential preparation. One of the things when we think about student success, when they're faced with all these different ways to enter an institution and move through the institution to reach whatever credential that they're seeking or whatever degree of education, degree incorrectly, whatever level of education they're trying to get, be that a set of small courses so they can get an advancement at work or an actual degree program or a certificate, we want to think about they can come in perhaps through the professional and continuing ed or through the traditional academic registrar side. And what if they want to switch? What if they want to move around? And what if they want to earn things simultaneously, parallel with each other? So we asked our respondents whether or not they have established pathways for converting this non-academic credit to academic credit. A little under half do, as we noted here. And among those, about half offer the option to undergraduates, 21% to graduate and professional learners, and about 21% the option to non-degree seeking learners. About 60% described these processes as working moderately well or better. A very tiny percentage said they work extremely well. About 40% said slightly well or not well at all. So it's good that we're leaning towards the positive side, but still some institutions are reporting that there's kind of a problem with this process. But then we also talk about the fact that over half of institutions with PCE and academic registrars units and overlapping in these offerings don't have a credit conversion pathway for students. So there's no way for them to take their learning from one side to the other or back again. And one of the things we talk about at ACRO and UPSEA is this learning mobility, the ability for however the learner has acquired the credit to take it with them. We have this challenge even within an institution with learning mobility for some. We asked them about the relationships. So remember, these are the responses not from the dyad, so not where we have one response from each unit, but just individual responses. We gave them some choices to pick from. So these are the fixed responses. Ask them how they work together. The more common one, the 33%, is regular non-strategic interactions that are operational in nature. A fewer said they have formal meetings to address mutual strategic policies and practices, so about a fifth of them. And occasional informal interactions, again, a quarter. But we had about 20%, so 1/5 say they operate separately from each other with nearly no interaction. And in the open-ended responses, which we have included in the report, you'll see them describe that relationship more detailed. So they didn't just be able to pick here, but they described it and said, why that is at their institution or what they thought about it. So that data is going to be available too. And following up on that idea, what is the relationship? We asked them about what are the barriers that impact, if any exist, the ability of the two units to work closely together. 86% believe that there were barriers. So all good intentions, institutions sometimes have roadblocks and bottlenecks and things that make it difficult for units to collaborate or cooperate or converge. And the perceived barriers among that 86% include a lack of common practices and common policies, over half from both of those, shared technologies, it was an issue for almost half, and serving a common learner population. So we talk about this. If you're trying to explain all of these things to students, how they're trying to move through the system, how they're trying to take multiple paths to get where they want, if there aren't any common practices or there's a lack of common policies or even shared technology, imagine the perspective from the student who doesn't live and breathe this every single day. Again, this is not unique to the PCE and the academic registrar relationship. We see this quite often elsewhere, where there's things that are roadblocks and barriers to relationships internally that then have these trickle-down effects of possibly impacting students. The technology overlap between departments, we asked them about that because they mentioned it as a part of the barriers. So among institutions with the PCE unit, a little over a third have no technology in common at all. So that's challenging when you're trying to move information back and forth between the two things. They'd have to move it into some shared database, perhaps, or a warehouse of reporting, and then move it over if they decided to and needed to. Otherwise, as a student, the student experience is they exist as an entity within the PCE and PCE unit, and they exist as an entity within the technology and the academic registrar side, even if they're taking programs or courses in both. So they perhaps could have to know 2 student ID numbers, 2 different types of logins, all at the same institution. We don't know that for sure, but that sends to kind of drift from this information, but we've not actually asked students yet about their experiences. It's going to be interesting if we can try to find students who do actually take classes in both of these areas and see what challenges they have from the student perspective and or what benefits they see as well. Very simple slide, because because I was trying to figure out how to do this. I could show a lot of data. I could have pulled up the charts that are available, because it will say as an appendix in the report exactly how the level to which they agreed, some, none, or all, and to each data point about policy and practice and the nature of their relationship. So small sample, when I always put that out there, we had only the 10 pairs. So they are at the same institution, these 10 pairs, but they didn't agree with each other pretty much at all. It was very, very little agreement about what their policies are, about what their practices are, who offers what credentials, who offers what credits, or even the description of the nature of the relationship between the two of them wasn't necessarily the same. So that, I don't think, surprised any of us to any degree, because we know how complex institutions can be, but it was very interesting that amongst the 10, they weren't sitting on the same page. Even if they described the relationship as a formal and strategic relationship, they didn't describe the rest of the things the same. They didn't understand what each other was offering and how they offered it. So what does this mean? So we try to come up with, like, how do you close out a report that has all this divergence and overlap and convergence and some collaboration? We landed on how higher ed can be learner-centric rather than revenue-centric, and that the cooperation between these two units when it comes to policy, practice, and technology to support various educational paths and opportunities would enhance educational opportunities for learners. In particular, the undergraduate adult learners who come in with some previous work experience and or college credits with them. We would say that it should be a lot more collaboration between these two units, especially when they're so divergent. If you've ever heard of the paradox of choice, that is the theory that if you are presented with, let's use Baskin Robbins, you go into Baskin Robbins or another place that even has more ice cream than the ice cream flavors in that, and you weren't prepared when you came in for which ice cream you wanted. So you're presented with all these choices, and it becomes difficult to decide which scoop you want. And sometimes you end up with two unrelated scoops. You end up with a rainbow sherbet and a chocolate almond or something because you couldn't decide. So it's the paradox of choice about students and learners. They are given so many choices in these examples that we have benchmarked here. They are exposed to all kinds of choices throughout their undergraduate career that it is probably causing some of them some decision-making problems, especially since the language that we use in higher education is not in the common vernacular for many students who don't have the background in higher education or don't have a lot of earned credits and haven't had time to learn that information. So definitely some opportunities for those who are members of UPSIA and those who are members of ACRO to come together and say, how can we get these units to try to work together a little within the context of their missions and goals at their institution, and making sure that we are sharing information and communicating with our learners in a way that's going to help them be successful. So before I hand it over to the panelists and I ask them a few questions here, I wanted to give a plug. That's why we used Convergence in the report title. Is ACRO and UPSIA are excited to join each other in a conference in Washington, D.C. called Convergence. And part of the subject is what we've been talking about today, as well as other things. And I'll maybe ask one of our panelists to chime in here after this and tell us a little bit more about that conference and more details about it if they'd like to share them. But wanted to put that out there before I have us introduce our panelists and do some questions. So again, we're having Mentally Gottlieb, Executive Director from ACRO, Bruce Etter, Senior Director of Research and Consulting at UPSIA, and Jim Fong, the Chief Research Officer at UPSIA. Join us for our panel. So I'm going to stop the sharing here. And welcome our panelists. If you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourselves, I just did briefly, but if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about yourselves, and then we will, if you want to, at that same time, Share what is your main takeaway from these data, because you actually got to see the report in advance.
All right. Should I start?
Either one.
All right. So I'm Melanie Gottlieb. I'm the executive director of ACRO. Prior to being with the association, I was an ACRO member and worked in higher education. So I started my career as a registrar and have worked through, I always say, all of the ACRO professions, from registrar right through up to vice president for enrollment management. You want me to answer the first question first? All right. So
Yes,
my
please.
main takeaway, I've got a few. I have a lot of things I'm thinking about it because the data is so all over the place. But actually, that wasn't particularly surprising to me. We know that while institutions do many of the same things, the way that they structure the work that they do is highly contextualized within the institution. And these PCE units often evolve from varying needs and varying times and varying individuals' brainchild. And so I think that's really how things happen at institutions. So it's not surprising to me. It was interesting to me that the dyads were only 10 institutions. And so that, I think, says something perhaps more about the differences in the ACRO and UPSIA membership. And I think that's something that I'm really excited about with this Convergence conference, because I think it's an opportunity for more of our members to be collaborating. So I think that's exciting. And it also says to me that really the PCE offices have perhaps in most cases, not all, but in a lot of cases been kind of deployed outside of a larger enrollment planning strategy. And so I think, to me, there's a giant opportunity there for institutions to be thinking about their PCE units as a piece of their larger enrollment strategy. So I will.
Melanie, can I follow up that one? Because one thing I
Yes.
forgot is we probably have members from UPSIA and ACRO who know nothing about each other on this webinar. So would you like to share a little bit about ACRO? And then I'll ask either Bruce or Jim to do the same about UPSIA too.
Yeah, I probably really should have done that. So yeah, so ACRO is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers. And we like to say we think we're the oldest higher ed association. We've been around since 1910. Our members are the records and academic services, transfer, international credit, admissions, and enrollment management folks. Our members see our learners from the beginning of the process right through to graduating them at the end, and everything in between. We have about 2,600 member institutions, about 11,000 individual members at those institutions, and that's probably enough for now.
Thank you. Either Bruce or Jim?
Jim, you want to go for it? Oh, me? All right. Wonderful. Well, yeah, Melanie, ACRO does have us beat. UPSIA was founded in 1915, so not too long after. So maybe we'll take second place there. But hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Etter. I am the Senior Director of Research and Consulting here at UPSIA. UPSIA is the association for professional continuing and online education. We've been doing a lot of different work within this space. I'll speak particularly from my role within research related to advancing some of these items. I think a lot of what you're talking about there, Melanie, is spot on, where, professional continuing education has often kind of been this organic off to the side thing. And I think more and more what we're starting to see is it has a seat at the table, right? Along with the other units of the institution. And I think that's critical when we're talking about attracting the new adult learner and the stackable pathway and all of these things where we're trying to be, I think the phrase Wendy used was learner-centric, and I think that's a good one. So at UPSIA, we touch on a lot of different things there. We have a little over 400 member institutions. and we do a variety of things, and we're really looking forward to the conference and hope you all can join us there. But I'll stop babbling and talk about my main takeaways from the data. And I think it's a pretty, I mean, I think that's one that a lot of folks will share, is that there needs to be more strategic conversations between these units and registrars. I think it's challenging to be learner-centric when we have internal disconnects. We saw that 19% said that the two units operate in distinct and separate entities with nearly no interaction, which I found a bit startling. 1 in 5 have nearly no interaction. And then if we move even just a step further, 25% have occasional informal interactions on this ad hoc basis. So I think this lack of communication, it's not surprising to see some of these barriers, some that are very real, and then I think others that are perceived and could be addressed through some of these conversations and dialogues. So I guess with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jim, to provide his main takeaway.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Melanie and Wendy. It's a great opportunity to be part of this. My name is Jim Fong. I'm the Chief Research Officer at UPSIA. I've been with UPSIA now for about 12 or 13 years. Prior to that, I was working on my own in education as a consultant for a few years. But before that, I spent about 8 or 9 years with Penn State in terms of launching their world campus and also within continuing education. So I got to participate in a lot of those kind of meetings there and it was difficult just to talk amongst ourselves about online and work with each other and converge with each other on a very focused mission around online, let alone now that we flash forward now 15 years and we're dealing with new issues here. I'm sitting here in a small college in the South, private institution, and yesterday I just presented to the President's Council in the Leadership Council here around some of these issues here. And my biggest takeaway here was I was basically living a lab environment here when I was talking about new credentials and the demographic cliff and all the challenges that we face in front of us. I was hearing from the systems people that our systems don't talk together, or we don't have processes, or how does this play into accreditation, or all these things, or how do we measure quality and what's the role in the employer? These are all things where we have got to learn how to work together, converge together. And as Bruce was mentioning, that one question, my biggest takeaway was that we're 1/3 of our organizations are having non-strategic meetings about these issues here, and 21% are having more formal meetings here. We all want to play nice and our intentions are good, but we really have to find a way to have a more unique mission, actually a more single mission around what education will be like in the future. I think we all agree, and I credit ACRO and UPSIA for bringing light to this issue here, because we've been operating in silos as our associations, but I think we're both seeing that there's a lot of opportunity for our organizations to work through. There's a lot of questions that the UPSIA PCO units can't get done without understanding what the ACRO constituents are doing, and vice versa. There's a lot of reasons to converge, but we've got to figure it out. And then from there, maybe we can start building better processes, better technologies, and then influence the other stakeholders around convergence. And convergence really means not only us, it means staff, it means faculty, it means our leadership, it means employers, it means how we interface with society, and it also means the accreditors. And I brought them up a few times because I think that's a challenge, because they look at things on a credit-based model, and that's a little different, as Wendy has kind of outlined. There's different currencies of learning that we're establishing, different credentials that we're establishing, and things that amount to that credential. It's just not credit. Sometimes it's CEU, sometimes it's micro credentials. All these things are adding up, which is making it complicated for accreditors and others that are sitting more in the fringes. That was a lot, but I think it opens up our discussion in a lot of different ways here. So I'll take a pause here.
I would
It
love
does,
to
Jim.
just comment on that and respond to that for a moment and just say, I think we're in a very different moment in higher education than we were in the past. I will share, and I think I've told this story to some of you, but I will share that when I started my career 25 years ago, my mentor in the field, who taught me how to do my job, told me that CEUs and credits were completely different animals, and never the two shall meet. They shouldn't be in the same system even, as though they might corrupt each other. And that was like the standard at the time. They were really completely siloed off. And I think within the records profession, we said, oh no, that's a different thing. We're not going to deal with that. And I think that the world has changed dramatically. I think that the expectations of the learner has changed dramatically, and the needs of the learner and the needs of the workforce. And I think institutions have an opportunity right now to really think about their non-credit work as an important pathway into credit, and as an important way to help them make a better representation of their value proposition to their communities. Because I think we have a PR problem in higher ed, and this is one of the ways, if we think strategically and thoughtfully about it, that we can solve that challenge.
Thank you, Melanie and Jim and Bruce. Great start to the conversation. And actually, I really love when you guys tag on to each other. Lets me sit back and absorb what you're talking about. So the second question I have for you and is, what trends do you perceive are occurring in practice and policy, and why relative to PCE and the academic registrars? And whoever would like to go first.
Let me jump into this one first, only because it's fresh in my mind as I sit in here in work on strategic planning with this small college here that's looking at new credentials and stackability. We all have heard the demographic cliff stuff, and we have challenges there with our demographics and not having enough 18 to 22 years old. And there's also a lot of challenges even within that. There's a lot of issues around, our students taking a gap year, are they going into other certificates? We're hearing a lot of states say that you don't need a degree here, or you're also hearing companies like Google and Starbucks and everybody else that say that some jobs no longer require that degree. So, but there's educational opportunities for us as institutions to do things better and differently. So I think that's the most major trend that I see. But as a result, I also look at that we've been slowly converging on a few things that I hope will even get better, that we can operate better. And one of them is, our technology, for example. One of the things that came up was that we have a lot of hurdles that are getting in our way. I think our intentions are right, but some of the hurdles could be, like you're on this platform or on this platform or whatever. 10 years ago, CRM systems were just a mess. There was a non-credit system and there was a credit system. And I think that we've kind of started converging that, because until we get to that point, can we really outline processes to work better across, credit versus non-credit and micro-credentials. And then it's really hard to develop processes with these other things getting in the way, let alone, people understanding them. So I think we have a compound problem that once we actually start addressing some of these baselines, we can start serving multiple audiences of learners better, not just the 18 to 22-year-olds who are looking at education very, very differently.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, the question is, where do you start? And I think the easiest spot would be to start with the similarities, right? We talked a lot about kind of the differences that some of these units have between the PCE unit and the academic registrar, but Wendy also showed a slide where there's overlap. And I think some of those areas where, instead of perceiving it as competition, we should be perceiving it as a way to raise the level of the lake for all boats. So starting with those similarities allows us to get that conversation going, build some momentum, see some positive return on some of those changes. And then I think that can advance through the institution, but also can gain momentum, right? Leadership sees this, so therefore we can throw some more dollars at it, some of those sorts of things. But I think starting with those similarities is a really important portion when we're talking about these trends. It's easy to focus on the differences, but I think it's also really important to emphasize where we have commonalities.
Bruce, I love that point, because when you're faced with these differences and that some overlap, and to Jim's point, the technology mismatches, it's like, where do you start? How do you decide you want to do that? And that's a very good point. Find where the similarities are. And the report will share that they do have some overlap where those do in technology, what areas they have overlap in, and again, about some of the processes. So that's a very good point. Thank you. Melanie, did you want to address trends that you perceive occurring in policy and practice?
Sure. First, one thing I didn't mention that I thought was surprising in the report is the number of institutions. I think there were 46%, you said, have established a pathway for converting non-credit to credit. I was pleasantly surprised by that number because that is not something that in the acro circles we hear a lot about. And I think that that's a really interesting and exciting untold story. And so I will personally be digging into those 46 to try to see if I can get some volunteers who want to talk about the work that they're doing and the processes. I think case studies around this kind of work, what worked at an institution, really helps ease the pathway for others. It gives them some ideas about the entree. And also, I think perhaps removes some of this sense of maybe they're not doing something right, or there's something wrong with converting credit to, non-credit to credit. I think it just destigmatizes the whole process in a way that I think would be very helpful. I think there is an opening right now. I think more of the records folks are more interested in this because they're seeing it proliferating all around them. And I think that registrars in particular have a value lesson to share with the PCE people in terms of how do you have the credential have value long-term. The registrars are the keeper of the larger institutional credentials. And I think that we can help those PCE credentials begin to carry more weight than perhaps they always do now. And so I think it's exciting to be able to converge those two practices. And I feel like there's never been a better time to do that people are really more ready for those conversations.
Let me kind of build off that a little bit, if you don't mind. Melanie, I love your optimism there. I too was surprised by that number, and I was being a little pessimistic, to be honest with you, because from my vantage point, the PCO units are struggling here, and to see that number was much bigger than I thought it would be. I thought because I sense a lot of frustration by our members about, can we get non-credit to credit, and then even when they do. It's not scalable. There's only a handful of institutions that can do it at scale. Otherwise, it's a very heavy walkthrough process about how much does this really work? Does it really convert on? Is this our same standards here, or do I have to send it off to ACE or somebody else to validate this? It's a very, very high labor, actually, and not automated process that and it's not consistent from institution to institution that are doing this. They accept different things. So I would actually challenge us, can we actually make the jobs easier for both the central party administration and the PCO unit to understand it better, so we can actually do this at scale? Because that, and this is back to the urgency of higher education now, is that that's going to give somebody a competitive advantage in the marketplace that can do that. I'd love to standardize it so we all have, at par, and that we can all kind of compete together, as opposed to one institution that can do it, or they let out quality standards and they can do it that way, or they can actually do it more at scale. And therefore, is it fair for them to grab that inordinate share of the market? Probably it is. It's Machiavellian way, yes. But I also question about, are we doing a disservice to the entire field by not helping people to do it at scale? Because the student that wants that, they're shopping. Generation Z is so savvy here. They're shopping, and that's a new adult learner here as they move forward here. They are shopping to see who will recognize their non-credit experiences at a higher rate than another institution.
Jim and Melanie, I want to follow up on a couple of things you guys said, because you're talking about standardization and common language and standard processes and other things like that, which made it pop into my head that one of the things we didn't address here, but we've addressed in other conversations at ACRO and elsewhere, is actually, for all of us on this webinar, all of our institutions probably have different definitions for what a badge is, what a micro-credential is, what a certificate is. And so if even we have different definitions for that, students trying to understand what that means in their shopping is a challenge in and of itself. And that's one of the things that ACRA's been discussing lately is like, we need to get a glossary out there, and we're going to try to bite it off in little pieces, take a few terms at a time, put it out there, have other memberships like member organizations like yours provide feedback so that we can try to standardize some of this language around all of these offerings that students are now faced with when they're shopping for higher education, so that we're all talking about the same thing. I have an example where one institution describes a badge as a single course. So that's a badge, where others will say, no, it's a series of courses, whatever that is. But I think we need to, in higher education, apply some standard language around it. And I think our two organizations and others can help us do that. We are at 1:46. Want to make sure we have a little bit of time. I don't think we have anything populated in the Q&A yet. It's not showing me anything yet. But I want to diverge a little bit, and this is not a question you've had in advance, so I'm going to give you a heads up, but it's one you can answer. I know you can. As we talk about this as a bit throughout this, how do you think all of these things we're talking about relative to PCE and choices and standardization and in the relationship with the academic registrar, how does it affect learners?
I think it's clear as mud to learners, to be quite honest. I feel like we don't do ourselves any favors. When I think about academic credit versus PCE, when a learner comes to an institution to earn a credential, whether it's a credit-bearing credential or a non-credit-bearing credential, what they're coming for is the reputation of the institution and the perceived quality of the learning that they're going to get based on that quality of the institution and the reputation of the institution. And so to me, I think this is an important thing for us to be moving forward with in converging our work, because to the learner, while one is an academic and one has workforce value, to the learner, they are both issued by the institution. And for the institution to not value them in, converting from one to the other, I think that that's doing the learner a disservice. And I think the learner would not view that in a very positive light.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the value proposition, right? I think it's clear as mud is a good start. But I also think that, there's so many different reports out there that show the general deterioration of the belief that a four-year college degree is the way to do it. And that's particularly true for younger generations, right? There was just a one in Inside Higher Ed, I think, or Higher Ed Dive, one of those two, last week around Gen Z seeing there's other options besides a four-year degree. And I think institutions need to recognize that and see that a lot of the time the PCE unit is a way to fill that hole, right? It's a way to start that pathway, right? It's not to say that they're going to end up at a degree, but they might. And I think giving students that option at the same institution is going to be wildly advantageous in the marketplace. So that's kind of my thought on it.
Well, my thought is kind of building off both of what you said. When it's clear as mud, yes, for those that have given us a chance, but I look at it as largely they don't look at us for this product or service. And Bruce has done a lot of research here as well, that learners don't really see us as anything beyond the degree and the credit. But society is moving in a way where there's other credentials and they're looking at other things, but they don't necessarily go to the campus and say, hey, where's that office for micro-credentials or certificates here? How do I get that? I don't think we've done a good job of communicating that because we haven't really done. So I feel like we don't even have the chance with them because they don't really necessarily think about that. So I think that for the potential learner, it's probably clear as mud. If they even consider us, I would like us to, and it's back to what you said, Wendy, here, is that We've got to get better with the language. Bruce again has done research on some of these language issues, but we've got to make it clear that we are an option for something beyond a degree here. And then we've got to reach, and those that know us and that experience us every year are 19.5 million or 19.1 million undergraduate students and 3 million graduate students that go on and do things. But we have so many more. We have hundreds of millions of others we could serve, including our own alumni, including people with just a high school diploma or GED or less, or we have a some college no degree piece of it. And the some college no degree piece of it doesn't realize that they could come back to us and possibly earn a credit certificate or a non-credit piece there where we can help them get that job that they want. So it's a lot of different things, I feel, but we've got to get better at communicating, for lack of a better word, and no disrespect in terms of those who relish the degree, but for something that's non-degreed or certificate or something that's not necessarily in that same category.
Thank you all. I want to check in with Seattle before we ask the last question. Seattle, did you have any follow-up you wanted to ask here?
No, I think we've covered all of it. Sounds good.
Been a little all over the place, but it's been very informative. I see one question in the Q&A. So since we have a little bit of extra time, because we only have one in there right now, wanted to ask you the final question that I did prep you with. What is your advice for institutions at this time relative to all of these issues? That's a big question though, isn't it?
Well, mine kind of leverages what I said early on here, is that we have multiple stakeholders. And in my experience here at this small college here is that when we put the continuing online education people in the same room with these other stakeholders, it was like they're talking two different languages here. In order for us to get convergence, we've got to start internally educating our stakeholders within the institution, if that's really important to us. The president, the provost, all the deans, they need to kind of, it's sort of like online education was 25 years ago here, is that there was no the appreciation really kind of took hold once people understood it, and it wasn't a bad thing. I think this whole non-degree kind of approach and non-credit approach, professional education, really starts with educating our own people and stakeholders on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would also note that, this is a spectrum. We're working towards convergence, but that may not be feasible for quite some time, right? At a particular institution for a variety of reasons. We saw nearly 9 out of 10 believe barriers exist that impact the possibility of a PC unit and academic registrar to work closely together. So we need to start addressing some of these challenges through communication. And as I said earlier, I also think looking for common ground first is a really good strategy, because it builds that camaraderie, that momentum, that agreement, that language that Jim's talking about, and it allows us to move forward in a more efficient fashion. There is a sense of urgency around this, but also if 9 out of 10 are saying we've got barriers, it's going to take a while to break down those barriers and find commonalities.
Thank you.
And I guess I would say, I'm actually at ACRO feeling a lot of urgency around this, because there's so much happening in this space. My advice to institutions would be that if you are not already thinking strategically about holistically about all of the credentials that your institution offers first, and ensure to think about those markets in a strategic way, to think about your enrollment and your strategy and the learners that you serve, I think you need to do that if you're not already doing it. And then the second thing I would say is that if you are not thinking about the pathway between PCE and credit, I think it is time to start examining those pathways, even in a little bit of early exploration, because I think in an equity-minded pathway forward for learners, it's going to be really important. And I think, as Bruce said, that market differentiation in your local communities is going to be really important. You want to provide more opportunities to engage with learners as opposed to less. And I think it's a rare institution at this point who is thinking in that, who's not thinking about how do we broaden the net.
Thank you all. I'm going to answer there's two quick questions. One's for me and one's for you. So I'll do the quick one easy. Is that a person asked if do we explore whether a credit is converted from non-academic to academic if it's noted on the transcript in our study? I think Bruce is typing an answer or was. We did not differentiate that point. We did ask about who transcripts it. And there's transcript all over the place. So multiple people are transcripting different things, but we didn't on that one. That's for future research. We pretty much just barely stuck our toe in the water on this, as you can tell, because it just kind of, everything we looked at opened the doors for other things. But I do have a question for the panelists that was posed here. In the view of the experts, that's y'all, who will define the future and lead the change, business or the market or academia? My sense is the latter will respond, but not lead to the inevitable change and fight the change the whole way. So academia will probably not lead it. That's this person's perspective. It wants to think, wants to know what you think.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question to ask, and one that we've actually done a little bit of research around at UPSIA. I think, Michael, your point is a good one about kicking and screaming the whole way. I think higher ed tends to move at a glacial pace. And we have operated with the same currency of learning for 100+ years, right? But I think what we're also seeing is that the private industry is already filling some of that need. Things that we're seeing with, LinkedIn Learning and Udacity and all these other services where they're gaining traction. And I think higher ed recognizes that, right? So I think it is a response. And I think there are going to be institutions that are more entrepreneurial, more risk-taking in that area. But employers are going to get the education that they want for their employees one way or the other. I think there's a preference to work with higher ed, but I also think there's a willingness to go outside of that to get their needs met. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think you're spot on, but there's a lot of data to back that up.
In the last couple of minutes we have, either one of you, either Jim or Melanie, would you like to respond?
I would say I think I agree that you are sort of spot on, although I would like to not characterize it in quite that way. I think the work that we're doing at ACRO and the work that we're doing to partner with UPSIA, I think that we are hoping to inspire more institutions to be leaders in that way. There are some institutions who are doing really excellent work in this space, and we are really hoping that we can inspire more institutions to step forward, because I think the institutions who are willing to be a little bit more bold and take a little more risk are actually going to see the payoff in the long run, because I think we are at a transformational moment in higher education, and we have to act and change and evolve to meet the needs of today's learners and tomorrow's workforce.
And I'm going to leave it on that optimism that Melanie has spoken about. I love it, Melanie. And otherwise, I'm going to start talking about gloom and doom and demographic cliffs and stuff like that. And I too believe that there's hope there, and our intents are right. It's the whole piece about innovation here. Do we really want to meet our students' needs by innovating and willing to take those risks? So I agree with you, Melanie.
I want to thank you all the panelists. And I was just told that while I was trying to show the Convergence slide, I was showing my notes. It says before I turn off the presentation and invite our panelists notes instead of the slide that was advertising the conference. It is again in DC. It's a Convergence Credential Innovations in Higher Education Conference in November, 1st through 3rd in Washington, DC. But thank you, Bruce, Jim, and Melanie in Seattle for joining us, and Nora for your translation, for joining us today for this webinar. You all, again, receive the report when it comes out on the 24th, that big, heavy report. Have some coffee. It's a meaty one. It'll be out there for you. And we also have other research coming out that starts to tag on to the things we found here, like who's doing what, how are they doing it relative to these different types of alternative credentials. So with that, and also Seattle posted, there's a webinar that's also next week that you might be interested in. So I wanted to thank you all very much for participating. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.